The night was cold, and the small town of Cedar Creek had been quiet for hours. But when the call came in, everything changed. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the local police received a disturbing report from a nearby resident. Smoke was billowing from the home of Emily Brighton, a 34-year-old single mother who had lived in the quiet neighborhood for over 5 years. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was already engulfed in flames. They found no sign of life inside, only the remnants of charred furniture and scorched walls. As the fire was being extinguished, Detective made a chilling discovery. Emily Brighton had not died in the blaze. Her body had been placed there after she was already dead. She had been poisoned. The fire was set to cover up the crime, but it had failed. The question that followed was simple, yet disturbing. Who killed Emily Brighton, and why? What followed was a complex web of lies, secrets, and betrayals, all hidden beneath the quiet surface of Cedar Creek. Emily Brighton's death would reveal a series of truths no one could have imagined, and when the truth came to light, it was too late for anyone to hide. Cedar Creek, a small, peaceful town nestled in the countryside, was known for its quiet streets and close-knit community. It was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other by name, and the biggest drama was the annual town fair. Families raised children here, retirees enjoyed their golden years, and everyone lived with the comforting thought that nothing could ever disturb the peaceful flow of life. Emily Brighton was an ordinary resident in this seemingly perfect town. At 34, she was a single mother raising 2 young children, both under the age of 10. She worked as a receptionist at the local dentist's office, a job that allowed her to stay close to home and care for her kids. Emily was known for her friendly smile and quiet demeanor, always lending a hand when needed but never drawing too much attention to herself. But Emily had her own set of struggles, hidden from the view of her neighbors. Though her life appeared simple and unassuming, there were cracks in the foundation that no one could see. A few people knew that Emily had recently ended a troubled relationship with a man named Jack, her on-again, off-again boyfriend. Yet no one knew just how deep her personal problems ran, or how dangerously close she was to someone who had a much darker side than anyone in Cedar Creek could have imagined. The night of May 5th, 2023, began like any other in Cedar Creek. Residents had long since gone to bed, the town resting quietly under the dark sky. But at 2:30 a.m., a call to the local fire department shattered the peace. A neighbor reported seeing flames coming from the roof of Emily Brighton's home. When firefighters arrived, they quickly began their efforts to put out the blaze. But something was off. The fire was too intense, too fast, and the house was already engulfed in smoke. It took hours to bring the fire under control, and when the flames were finally extinguished, the damage was devastating. The structure of the house had been destroyed. But more importantly, Emily Brighton was found dead inside. The initial assessment suggested that the fire was the cause of death, but something didn't sit right with the detective. The fire was too hot and Emily's body had no burns. Her skin was cold to the touch, indicating that she had been dead long before the flames started to spread. It quickly became clear that this wasn't a case of accidental death. Emily Brighton had been murdered. The fire had been set to cover up the crime, but the flames failed to do their job. The truth about how she died would soon come to light. Detective began to look for other signs of foul play. A toxicology report revealed that Emily had been poisoned before the fire. The cause of death was determined to be poisoning, a lethal dose of cyanide found in her bloodstream. The poison had done its job. Emily had died before the fire even started. The question now was, who could have been behind such a calculated and brutal act? Emily had few enemies, and there was no obvious suspect. But as the police started to piece together the facts, they realized that there was more to Emily's life than anyone had suspected. Detectives began their search for any potential leads. They spoke to Emily's friends, family, and co-workers, all of whom described her as a kind, quiet woman who had few close relationships but had never shown any signs of distress. But the deeper the detective dug, the more they uncovered a troubling story of hidden relationships and secrets that Emily had kept to herself. One of the first people the detective turned to was Jack, the man Emily had recently broken up with. Jack had been known to have a volatile temper, and there were rumors of emotional abuse during their relationship. However, Jack had a solid alibi. He had been at his own apartment the night of the fire, confirmed by neighbors and phone records. As the investigation continued, the focus shifted to a different person in Emily's life: David Miller, a local businessman who had been seen at Emily's home several times in the weeks leading up to her death. He had claimed to be just a friend of Emily's, but his connection to her was more complicated than he was willing to admit. David had been one of the last people to see Emily alive. He had visited her just days before the fire, but his visit hadn't been a friendly one. As the police questioned him, David's story began to fall apart. He claimed that he had been at a business meeting during the time of the murder, but evidence quickly contradicted this. A series of phone records, along with surveillance footage from a nearby store, placed David at Emily's house the evening before the fire. It became clear that David Miller had lied. But why? What had motivated him to kill Emily? With David Miller's alibi unraveling, the detective delved deeper into his connection to Emily Brighton. They learned that while he had indeed claimed to be just a friend, his involvement in Emily's life was much more than casual. In fact, Emily had been working for David's business for several months as a part-time assistant, handling various administrative tasks. The two had often met to discuss work-related matters, but Emily's colleagues recalled noticing a certain tension whenever they were around each other. It wasn't just professional. Emily had mentioned a few times to her close friends that she was unsure about her relationship with David. She described him as controlling and sometimes too persistent, especially after they started working together more closely. However, no one had ever suspected that things had escalated to the point of murder. The breakthrough in the case came when detectives combed through David's phone records and emails. They found numerous messages between him and Emily that appeared innocent on the surface, but some of them were strangely aggressive and domineering. One message stood out. "I thought we agreed you wouldn't see anyone else, Emily. This needs to stop now." It was sent just days before her death. The detective now had a clear picture of a man who might have become obsessed with her. David Miller had been more than just a business associate or casual friend. He was someone who was trying to control Emily's personal life. But what could have driven him to murder? The detective continued their search for any evidence that would confirm their suspicions. They obtained the surveillance footage from the local store near Emily's house. The footage clearly showed David arriving at Emily's home the evening before the fire, carrying a small bag that appeared to be from a local hardware store. He was seen entering the house, but the camera did not capture him leaving. At first, this seemed inconclusive. But after further analysis, detective realized that the security footage had been edited. David was not on the footage when he left the house. Someone had tampered with the cameras, covering up his departure, possibly to hide the evidence of his involvement. The more detective looked into David's background, the more troubling details emerged. He had been involved in a series of legal disputes in the past, some related to business practices, others involving personal matters with ex-girlfriends. In each case, his anger and jealousy seemed to be recurring themes. It appeared that his pattern of controlling behavior had escalated over time, leading him to act violently when he lost control. At this point, the detective had gathered a significant amount of evidence pointing to David, but they needed something more to secure an arrest. They turned to the autopsy report for any additional clues. It revealed that the cyanide poisoning had been administered in a way that suggested the use of food or drink, likely something Emily had ingested. No traces of cyanide had been found on any of the household objects, ruling out the possibility that it had been introduced through something Emily had touched or come into contact with. After further investigation, a key detail emerged. Emily, had recently started drinking a particular brand of coffee that she bought from a local store. The coffee had a distinctive taste, and Emily was known to enjoy it every morning. The detective were able to obtain a sample of the coffee, and when they had it tested, the results were clear. High levels of cyanide were found in the ground beans. It didn't take long for the detective to piece everything together. David Miller had likely poisoned Emily using the coffee she drank daily. He had known about her routine and had poisoned the coffee in a way that would not immediately raise suspicion. Afterward, he set the fire to destroy the evidence. But he had miscalculated, leaving the body behind when the fire failed to completely cover up his crime. With this new evidence in hand, the police arrested David Miller on suspicion of murder. His earlier claims of being an innocent bystander in Emily's life were now exposed as lies. The question remained, why had David decided to kill her? As the detective built their case against him, they discovered that David had been deeply in debt. His business had suffered from poor decisions, and he had been desperate to keep up appearances. Emily, who had recently begun dating someone else, had reportedly told friends that she was planning to break things off with David for good. It seemed that David's possessiveness and control over her had gone too far, and in the end, he couldn't accept the idea of losing her. As the police pieced together the evidence, the motive became clear. David had not only murdered Emily out of jealousy and control, but had done so to protect his own crumbling life. The murder had been a desperate act to maintain his hold on her and to hide his own failures from the world. Just when the case seemed to be heading toward a straightforward resolution, a shocking new twist emerged. As the investigation continued to unfold, a crucial piece of evidence had been overlooked. In the chaos surrounding the initial stages of the case, the police had failed to examine all of Emily's personal belongings. It wasn't until detective took another look at her computer and personal journals that they uncovered something that would change everything. Emily had been keeping a secret that even her closest friends and family didn't know about. She had been in contact with someone else, someone completely unexpected. Months before her death, Emily had started an online correspondence with a man named Samuel Harris, someone she met through a personal ad. Samuel lived in a neighboring town and had been a regular presence in Emily's life for several months. They had been planning to meet in person, and in her journal, Emily had written that she was hoping to start a new chapter of her life with him, away from the toxic influence of David Miller. The discovery of these letters and messages cast a new light on Emily's death. While David had been the obvious suspect due to his possessive nature and his manipulative behavior, the evidence now pointed to another possibility. Emily had been planning to leave Cedar Creek entirely. Samuel Harris, the man she had been communicating with, had no known criminal background. But could he have had a hidden motive for being involved in Emily's life? The investigation quickly turned to Samuel Harris. Detective tracked him down, but he proved to be elusive. It took weeks before they were able to bring him in for questioning. When they finally found him, they discovered that Samuel had been more involved in the town's social fabric than anyone had realized. While Samuel had presented himself as a kind and caring man, his true nature was far more complicated. Samuel had a history of manipulation, though it hadn't appeared in public records or police reports. In fact, Samuel had been in trouble with the law on more than one occasion, though it had all been covered up. He had a pattern of forming relationships with vulnerable women, and once he had control, he used their emotional attachment to manipulate and control them. The police uncovered more alarming details. Samuel had been aware of David Miller's abusive tendencies and had begun making plans to meet with Emily. In his private conversations with Emily, he had subtly encouraged her to sever ties with David, feeding into her growing desire to escape the toxic relationship. But there was something darker hidden beneath his so-called concern for her well-being. Samuel had known that David was not going to let Emily go easily. When questioned about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, Samuel's story seemed rehearsed. His alibi was shaky, and there were inconsistencies in his timeline. He claimed to have been in another town at the time, but phone records and receipts from a nearby gas station contradicted his account. The most chilling revelation came when detectives searched Samuel's belongings. They discovered that he had been following Emily's movements much more closely than anyone had realized. His journals contained detailed notes on her routines, her work schedule, and even her plans to meet Samuel in person. Samuel had known exactly when she would be alone and vulnerable. The evidence was now pointing to him as an accomplice in the plot to kill Emily. But what was his true motivation? The investigation now turned to the possibility that Samuel had been working with David Miller. The two men had more in common than anyone had suspected. Both were driven by jealousy and control, and both had been determined to have Emily for themselves. While David had resorted to murder to keep her under his control, Samuel may have been the one who had initially poisoned her, hoping to make her death look like a tragic accident caused by her own mistakes. The real twist, however, came when a full forensic examination of the poison used on Emily was completed. The cyanide had been administered in a way that suggested it wasn't just a random choice of poison. The specific chemical used could only be traced back to a very particular source, a chemical supplier that both Samuel and David had access to, but not Emily. With the two men now linked by their involvement in Emily's murder, the investigation took an even darker turn. It became clear that Samuel and David had been in contact before the crime, possibly even discussing the best way to eliminate Emily. The motive? Both men had been driven by the same intense, obsessive need to control her, and when Emily made plans to leave, it was more than either of them could bear. As the case moved forward, the spotlight shifted from mere suspicion to concrete charges. David Miller and Samuel Harris, once considered by many in the town as pillars of the community, were now facing serious legal consequences for the murder of Emily Brighton. With the evidence stacking against both men, the prosecutor had a clear path. David Miller's initial attempts to cover up his involvement in the crime with false alibis and tampered surveillance footage were now irrelevant. Samuel Harris's role in the murder, from his involvement in Emily's emotional manipulation to his detailed knowledge of her routines, made him a co-conspirator in the eyes of the law. The two men had worked together to poison Emily and stage the fire that was meant to destroy any trace of their crime. Both men were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and tampering with evidence. The legal proceedings that followed would prove to be as complex as the crime itself. Emily's family, devastated by her death, fought for justice, and the town, once proud of the men involved, was now left reeling from the revelations. The trial began with opening statements from the prosecution, who painted a grim picture of two men, David, obsessed with control and power, and Samuel, a man driven by possessiveness masked as concern. The prosecutor outlined how David's toxic relationship with Emily had escalated to the point of murder. They pointed to his increasingly erratic behavior in the months before the crime, including the final message to Emily before her death. The defense, however, argued that David Miller had been the victim of a tragic misunderstanding, and that he had no intention of killing Emily. They suggested that Samuel Harris had manipulated both Emily and David, and that David had been deceived by Samuel's false claims of concern for Emily's well-being. The defense insisted that the fire had been an accident and that the poison was something Emily had ingested unknowingly, perhaps even self-administered. Samuel Harris's defense was similarly weak. His lawyers tried to argue that he had acted out of a misguided sense of concern for Emily, but the prosecution demolished this argument by pointing to the increasingly controlling nature of Samuel's communications with her. His journal entries, detailing every aspect of Emily's life, were presented as evidence of his obsession with her. As the trial went on, the most damning pieces of evidence were the forensic reports. The poison used, cyanide, had been carefully administered in a way that only someone with intimate knowledge of Emily's routine could have known. Samuel had tracked her habits, while David had been the one to ensure she couldn't leave the town. The two men, despite their differing roles in the crime, were bound by their shared desire to control Emily. After weeks of testimony, the trial reached its dramatic conclusion. The defense attorneys attempted one final move. They called on character, witnesses, trying to show that David and Samuel had been decent men with no history of violence. However, this attempt failed miserably. The town's once held belief that these men were harmless, upstanding citizens was shattered under the weight of the facts. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict on both counts, first-degree murder and conspiracy. Both men were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Collins family, it was a bittersweet victory. While they had received justice, they had lost Emily forever. The impact of the trial rippled through Cedar Creek. The community, once proud of its reputation for safety and simplicity, was left with the grim reality that the people they had trusted had been hiding dark secrets. The quiet, tight-knit town was forever changed, its innocence shattered by the actions of two men who had been living right under their noses. The trial may have been over, but the wounds left by Emily Brighton's death would take much longer to heal. Her children were left without their mother, and the residents of Cedar Creek had to come to terms with the fact that sometimes, even in the most peaceful of places, the darkest secrets can be hidden for far too long. The case of Emmeline Brighton serves as a stark reminder that even the most serene of communities can harbor secrets too dark to imagine. In Cedar Creek, a town once defined by its peace and trust, the shocking events surrounding Emily's murder left an indelible mark. For her family, the legal proceedings brought some semblance of closure, but the void left by her death could never be filled. The community, too, had to reckon with the truth that the people they thought they knew were capable of the unthinkable. David Miller and Samuel Harris, once trusted individuals in the town, were now confined to the pages of a tragic story that would be remembered for years to come. As the dust settles on the case, questions linger. How well do we really know those around us? What lies beneath the surface of everyday life, and how far can someone go to keep their darkest secrets hidden? In Cedar Creek, the truth was buried for far too long, and by the time it came to light, it had already claimed a life. Emily's story is a sobering reminder that no place is completely safe from betrayal, no matter how idyllic it may appear. The shocking twists and revelations in her case show how carefully hidden secrets can lead to disastrous consequences. As the town rebuilds, Emily's memory remains, urging those left behind to ask the difficult questions and to never take the safety of their community for granted again.